Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? The same murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. And tonight, we're going to be talking about strange ways people have lived. I started out, I was going to write about strange buildings, but it just kind of morphed into more about the people that were living there than the places they were living, so I changed the name to Strange Ways to Live. There was a Japanese man who became mystified when food kept disappearing from his kitchen. It was the kind of thing you'd ignore at first. How many times have you looked in the refrigerator thinking you put something in there only to not be able to find it? Well, this went on long enough that the man began to suspect somebody was breaking in while he was at work. He set a few cameras around his home to catch the culprit in the act. After returning from work, he played back the cameras and was amazed to discover a woman emerging from one of the backroom closets. Well, he wondered, how did she get into the closet without being seen entering the house by any of the other cameras? He called the police. And when the authorities arrived, they searched the house, looking for any clues as to who the woman was and how she was getting into the home. After all, there were no signs of breaking and entering. In the closet, they discovered there was a scuttle hole that led up into the attic. Looking up into the space, they discovered a 57-year-old woman was living in the attic. She had a bed and clothing laid out for use. The woman was arrested for trespassing. She said she was unemployed and she needed some place to stay. One day, when she managed to sneak into the man's home, she clomb up into the attic and proceeded to live there. During the time he was home, she would remain very still. She only came down while he was away. He followed such a strict schedule, the woman knew when he would be home, and that's when she would hide before he got there. Apparently, she had been living in the attic for months without having been found. Here in Laredo, the police had a gym, which was right next door to their brand new police station. It had been a barracks back when the air base was still here, and the city had converted it to be used by the officers for physical fitness. One morning, one of the officers saw a man slipping out the window of the gym. He lifted the window, stepped out, and then he closed the window behind him. The officer approached the man and questioned him. It turned out to be a guy that we referred to as the Ultimate Warrior. The name was coined from James Bryan Hellwig, also known as James Justice Hellwig. Eventually, Hellwig renamed himself as the Ultimate Warrior. Part of his trademark was having bands wrapped around each arm above the bicep with long streamers that hung down. Well, the homeless guy here in Laredo had bits of rags tied around each arm, just like the wrestler. So, us and the Border Patrol began calling him the Ultimate Warrior. Well, this Ultimate Warrior had been living in the gym at night when none of the officers wanted to work out. He'd been doing this for months. Our guy was mostly passive up until you got him in the back seat of a unit. Once in the vehicle, he would go limp. It was like trying to pull a lump of jello out of the back seat. He didn't resist, he just didn't help. And he was a big 'un, too. He must have weighed around 300 pounds, and most of this was right around the middle. He also had real long black hair and a Fu Manchu type mustache. Oddly enough, the mustache was white. Any questions asked would be answered with yes. I made this mistake one time. I saw the guy and I thought he looked a little suspicious, so I began questioning him. And I asked him if he was from Mexico, to which he said yes. So I asked him if he was here illegally, and he said yes. Well, I was writing him up when I asked him where he had crossed the river, to which he said yes. I asked him a few more questions. All of the answers were the same. Well, I called for a supervisor since this was beyond my pay grade. After a few minutes of getting nothing but yes, we determined the guy was not removable since we couldn't determine citizenship. We wound up turning him over to the MHMR here in Laredo. Now, that place had some interesting people living there. Months later, we went down to Zapata to set up a temporary checkpoint. Well, my classmate Jimmy pulled up with the Ultimate Warrior in the back seat of his unit. Jimmy hadn't been introduced to the man yet. As soon as I saw the guy, I was at a loss. How did he get all the way to Zapata? Well, he did say yes a lot. It took 5 of us to pull the guy from the back seat. He was holding a box of Colonel Sanders chicken, mostly bones. He would hold the box in one hand and pull a bone out and begin munching with the other. Well, his pants, which were way too big, wound up falling down to the ground. There he was, standing right next to the checkpoint, in all of his glory. The folks driving up were treated to a full display of his anatomy. We then just told him to get back in the car, which he did. Jimmy drove him over to the county MHMR, and they somehow got the guy out of the back of the sedan. About a month later, the Ultimate Warrior was back in Laredo, living in a store which was under construction. I haven't seen the guy in a few years, but then I've been retired for a while. Way back in another life, I was a firefighter. It seems like centuries ago, but it was actually only 30 years. I loved being on the end of the nozzle. Inside burning structures, putting the wet stuff on the red stuff. It was hot. It was smoky. It was dangerous. But I liked it. It was the best job I ever had. Better than being a tanker. I lived on Gale Street, which was just off of Toddville Road. The house is no longer there. When I moved to Laredo, I wound up moving into an apartment building on Gale Street, which is just another weird coincidence that makes no sense. North of where I lived was a weird building that some called the Toddville Road Mansion, while others just called it that weird building. It was given a new name in October 1984. It became known as the Murder Mansion. William List was a millionaire who built a 34,000 square foot home on 4.5 acre lot that backed up on Galveston Bay. Rather than using wood for the framing, the home was framed with 175 tons of steel. There were steel burglar bars, over every window. Even the skylights had bars over them. List was a bit paranoid about somebody breaking in. Well, he also had a history of sexual abuse. He'd been convicted in 1959 for his unhealthy appetites. This didn't stop him from driving up and down Montrose looking for young boys. Just about everybody living in the Houston area knew about Montrose and Westheimer area. It was an interesting neighborhood. In the late 70s, William List built his dream home, which was a bizarre-looking structure, nearly as bizarre as his personal life. Well, somehow I managed to get invited to a party at the mansion through some more bizarre circumstances. While walking out of the Kroger store, 1983, a car backed out of a parking spot, nearly hitting us. The driver apologized profusely, and then he told us he was having a party at his house and we were invited to come. He must have thought we were lawyers or something, because he did nearly run us down. And knowing about the huge building on Toddville Road and really wondering what it looked like on the inside, we agreed to go. It was as weird as I had thought. We entered through the garage, which looked big enough to hold about 20 cars. There was a set of steel and concrete steps that led up to the game room. It was more like a giant bar with a pool table. There was a catwalk that led out to the atrium. This room, if you could call it that, was 3 stories tall, and it had a garden, a pool, a lounge area, a workout area with weights and a huge fountain, as well as a great big jacuzzi. This room was almost big enough to fly a plane around inside. In fact, it was definitely as big as a lot of hangars I've seen. At the far end of the catwalk, and I do mean far, was a second section of the building where the bedrooms were located. William List was sitting in a lounge area, talking to about a half dozen other guests, and he told us to just wander about and enjoy his home. Well, being a firefighter, I took in the fact that just about nothing in the building was flammable. The furniture was about the only thing that might burn. The stairs were all steel and cement. The floors were thick cement, strong enough to support a few 18-wheelers. The walls were mostly steel studs, but there were a few wooden studs thrown in, and everything was covered with thick sheetrock. Every opening into the house was covered with burglar bars. The doors, the windows, any means of entering was covered. The view of Galveston Bay was hindered by the floor-to-ceiling bars that covered the back porch. This place didn't so much look like a mansion as a giant jail. As we were walking through the bedrooms, there were a few odd-looking guys standing around that seemed to be keeping an eye on us. I began keeping an eye on them since they all looked suspicious. Now, I was a firefighter. I hadn't gotten into law enforcement yet, but still I had a weird vibe about these guys. Once we'd seen the entire place, List invited us to stay and have some drinks. Well, none of us drank booze, and he looked to be well along into a bottle, so we thanked him for his hospitality and headed home. The main subject of conversation was not the house or how odd it looked, but it was the guys we had run into and how weird they all behaved. In a weird twist of fate, in 1983, Debbie Thornton, who was List's daughter, met some guy at a party and she decided to go home with him. As they lay there in bed, asleep, the man's ex-girlfriend, along with her new boyfriend, broke into the house. The two intruders attacked and murdered the couple in bed, using a pickaxe to beat them both to death. When asked why they did it, the killers couldn't come up with an answer. They were both strung out on drugs, and neither of them was thinking too clearly. William had 4 live-in boys that he would pay to clean his house. They were also there to entertain him when he felt like being a bad boy. One of his boys was called Smiley, and Smiley liked to use drugs. I don't know if List supplied the drugs, or just paid them enough they could buy their own, but all of these live-in companions were strung out most of the time. Along about October, the boys had grown tired of List. He had some rather unusual and sometimes painful things he liked to do. They began to conspire to kill him. Well, the oldest of the boys said he couldn't do it. He just didn't have it in him. He was too squeamish to pull the trigger. The youngest boy said he'd do the deed, but the others decided that he should not be the killer. So Smiley said he would kill List. When List had left the house for work, the 4 used a bunch of drugs and then began trashing the house. They threw potted trees into the swimming pool. They knocked holes in the walls. 1 or 2 of them cut furniture up, scattering stuffing all over the place. They wrote on the walls and the floor saying that List was a sick man and that he should die, and the Smiley signed his name to it. They managed to stay high for most of the day, up until List drove up in his car. The Smiley was standing on the catwalk with one of the other boys standing at the top of the stairs. As List walked up the steps, Smiley pulled the trigger, hitting List in the head. The murderers, yes, they all conspired to kill List, so they were all guilty, rounded up anything they thought they might be able to use or sell, and they left the scene of the crime. They used one of List's credit cards to buy new clothes and a plane ticket to Illinois for one of their members. The folks at List's business, where he made 18-wheeler trailers for the oil field, were worried when he didn't come to work. They called the house, and then they called the police. When the 3 remaining boys tried to cash a check after the police had found the body, they were all arrested. Smiley confessed to pulling the trigger, and he received a 45-year sentence. He also received a life sentence for breaking his probation for a robbery. Go figure. 45 years for first-degree murder, life for breaking probation. One of his co-conspirators made a plea bargain, and he received 15 years for credit card fraud. As for the guy who flew to Illinois, he was never arrested for his part in the crime. Illinois has some weird thoughts when it comes to things like murder, especially when they take place in other states. The youngest member of the gang was given juvenile probation. That'll teach him not to conspire to commit murder ever again. As I was preparing for tonight's show, I watched a YouTube video taken by someone who's inside the List mansion. The camera was panning around the front windows, showing a bunch of vehicles parked outside. I looked at the pickup, parked at the end of the line, and, well, it looked just like my old pickup, toolbox and all. Of course, everybody owns a pickup in Texas, but still. I wonder if the film was shot the same day of our visit. Talk about a coincidence. The last twist to this story is what happened to List's son. After being disowned by his father, Ron turned to Jesus. He became a very spiritual person. When the murderer of his sister was being tried, Ron went to her and talked to her about forgiveness. She became a very spiritual person as well, as far as anyone could say. It may have been the impending death sentence, or just maybe she really was sorry for what she had done. Ron was there the day of her execution to show her his support. A lot of people being incarcerated for crimes turn to religion as either a salve for their guilty conscience or as a ploy to garner a lesser sentence. I knew a lot of prison guards over the years, and they all said it was funny how the hardened criminals would act all nice and contrite as long as a camera was on or there was a liberal reporter in the room. My brother spent 20 years in prison. He was a guard. The final thing about the murder mansion before it was torn down, a movie was filmed in the List mansion. The movie was called The House on Toddville Road. David Harrod, Terry Harrell, Rodney Scott, and a bunch of other actors I've never heard of. The plot goes, a doctor is called to the bedside of a dying ex-lover, only to find her living in the midst of a bizarre and sinister cult. As the cult leaders labor to make him one of their own, the good doctor plots with the disaffected cult member to escape. Meanwhile, the doctor's ex has plans and schemes of her own. The trivia piece on the movie said, the house on Toddville Road was a real place in the city called Seabrook, Texas, south of Houston, where murders as in more than one, were committed by the reclusive owner, which would mean that Smiley had somehow bought the place. It has since been torn down to make room for a small, high-end housing development. Speaking of films made in Seabrook, 1987, a movie called Full Moon in Blue Water, starring Gene Hackman, was shot on, you guessed it, Toddville Road. We never saw any of the cast in town. They came zipping by in their chauffeur-driven limousines. The area where they were shooting was off limits to everybody. And then everybody would leave. I lived less than a half a mile from the site, and I never saw anyone. Well, I never saw the movie either. Have you ever sat there and wondered, how many murderers have you been around in your lifetime? It doesn't have to be somebody you knew very well, but somebody you were around on a regular basis, never knowing what they were capable of. Say that guy in high school that always acted kind of weird. I used to work with a couple of guys. They were both from El Paso. One murdered his wife. The other murdered his girlfriend and then shot himself. One day I arrested a guy who it turned out was an enforcer for the Texas Syndicate. He was a very nice, courteous man. He didn't give me any trouble, and up until we began processing, we had no idea who he was. When he took his shirt off, his tattoos told the story. When I took his photo, I jokingly said, "Smile," and he did. If you were to meet this guy on the street, you'd never guess he was a career criminal with a very checkered past. Enforcers were sometimes the last person you would see in prison. Once we knew who he was, I had to ask why he didn't try to run or fight. He said he knew he was going back to jail, and to him it was just like going home. He told me he didn't try to fight me because word would get back to the prison and some guard would make him pay for fighting with law enforcement agents. As he was being led out to the van to take him back to jail, he stuck out his hand, and I shook hands with him. He said, "See you later," and away he went. Wonder where that guy is today. Back when I was working in construction, we hired a guy who admitted he had just gotten out of prison. When asked what he did, he admitted to second-degree murder. Well, the boss decided to give him a chance, and Charles became a member of our crew. He was a hard worker, but he didn't talk much. He did what he was told, and he worked as hard as two men. Once he'd been around for a few weeks, he decided I was okay. He told me he'd actually been in prison twice, both times for murder. Both times he had been given a life sentence, which amounts to 8 years if you behave. Charles had spent 16 years in prison. And yes, he had all of the appropriate tattoos. One Friday, Charles didn't show up for work. This was odd because he was always very prompt and a good worker. Well, this, and the fact that it was payday. The following Tuesday, Charles came by at about 10 o'clock in the morning, and he asked the boss for last week's check. He grabbed his check and then left. Well, a while later, we found out Charles had gotten into a fight Thursday night, and his victim was at death's door in the hospital. He was a really nice guy that was horrible when he got drunk. Speaking of drunks, I knew a guy that was a regular at the county jail. He'd get drunk and he'd get in a fight and then he'd wake up in jail. He'd pay his fine and then leave. One day he woke up hungover and feeling like death, and he asked the guard when he'd get to see the judge so he could pay his fine and go about his way. He was informed by the guard he was looking at prison time this go-around for murder. He was heard in the bar to say, "I am going to kill that guy," and then he did. It was deemed premeditated murder because he announced his intentions before attacking. Once in prison, this guy managed to stretch an 8-year sentence out to 18 years. Lots of time in solitary confinement. Would you believe 6 years total in solitary? To this day, he has no recollection of what he did. Alcohol can do that to people. The folks at AA have a saying. First, the man takes a drink. Then the drink takes a drink. And then the drink takes the man. If you've ever had a blackout while drinking, I would highly recommend you stop before you wake up after having done something you're going to regret the rest of your life. Just thinking about it for a few minutes, I came up with 7 different people that I knew. I worked with a few of them. I sometimes wonder how many people I've met in passing that turned out to be far worse than just the mean drunks. Henry Lee Lucas is supposed to have tried to kill someone in the apartment complex where I lived. The manager was interviewed by the police and the news reporters. She had positively ID'd Lucas as having been at the complex the same night of an attempted murder. This was on the same floor as I was living on, but it was at the other end of the building. Don't you know, the apartments were also on Toddville Road. And then there's Mr. Whistle. We didn't really know the guy's name, so those of us in the patrol just called him Mr. Whistle. He was a white guy, which is kind of unusual because there aren't a whole lot of white people in Laredo. Maybe a few thousand, but considering there's 180,000 people here, well, anyway, he would stand in the traffic lanes in front of bridge number 2. And his job was to direct cars to keep them moving and keep them from blocking the intersections. And he always had a whistle in his mouth. Well, we would have to get from one side of I-35 to the other, and the quickest way was just to cut through the traffic lanes. Traffic was never that dense, it was never that difficult, we didn't go too fast, we never really were in danger of hitting anybody, but Mr. Whistle hated this. He would blow his whistle at us, and he'd shake his fist, and he'd threaten to do all kinds of things to us, not realizing that he was just a security guard and we were federal agents. Yes, we were breaking a few rules a little, but we weren't really that bad, and he was making too big of a deal out of it. This went on for months. And then one night on either America's Most Wanted or maybe it was Unsolved Mysteries, I'm not too sure which one, it was a Robert Stack show, there was a story about a man who was being sought for the murder of his wife. The man had killed his wife and then disappeared, and the police were looking for him all over the country. When they put the man's photo up at the TV screen, the people at the TV station said they received something like 200 phone calls from Border Patrol agents, all saying that they could find their man standing in front of Bridge 2 blowing a whistle. If he'd have just stood there and directed traffic, I don't think anybody would have noticed him. But he made such a big scene every time I saw him that his face was indelibly imprinted on my mind, and, well, when you're wanted by the police for murder, you really shouldn't make a big deal out of yourself. And on that happy note, I'm going to take a brief pause, play a couple commercials. Don't go away, we'll be right back after this. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Did you hear a bump in the night and you think it just might be a ghost? Contact the Laredo Paranormal Research Society at laredoparanormal@hotmail.com. That's the LPRS for all your otherworldly needs. If you need to squint and hold things out at arm's length to see them, maybe you should get your eyes checked. Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, is right across from the Embassy Suites. Stop squinting and start seeing. Back in 1776, someone said, "Give me coffee or give me death." And if that's how you feel, you should be at the Organic Man Coffee Tribe. They make coffee the right way, one delicious cup at a time. 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. Coffee, the stuff dreams are made of. Are you taking care of your skin, or are you going to wait and see how time treats you? Take care today by contacting Lourdes James, Independent Beauty Consultant, at 956-723-3019. Don't let time get the best of you. This is Arkanasa Radio you've been listening to. And welcome back to the show. With all those murderers that I've known from the past, it kind of makes me wonder. Next time you're feeling secure sitting at home, try thinking about how many people you have met that might just have a few skeletons in their closets or in their backyards. I heard this next story on expanded perspectives. It's a really weird way to live. In 1978, a helicopter pilot was flying over the forests of Siberia in Russia when he spotted something that caught his attention. There was a clearing with what looked like rows of planted food in the middle of nowhere. The nearest inhabited structure was 150 miles away. The pilot circled the field, looking it over, trying to see if maybe he was mistaken. His bosses had sent him out to find a decent landing spot for a geological survey team that was going to check the area for possible iron ore exploration. All of the records back at the airport said that no one was living in this forest. Looking down at what for all intents and purposes was a plowed field, the geologist asked the pilot to find some place to land so they could get a better look. The pilot began making several passes over the surrounding forest, looking for any clearing wide enough for a safe landing. Down amongst the trees, the crew saw a building of sorts next to a small stream. After going up the mountain, they discovered a log cabin sitting beside a tree. A stream. The pilot had located a landing spot and he set the helicopter down. The geologists, as well as the pilot, began walking through the trees to see who, if anyone, was living in such a remote spot. As they approached the cabin, they could see it was built from logs. It was covered with hand-hewn planks, and it looked abandoned. But the cabin was actually the home of 5 people. The folks living in the cabin invited the geologists inside. The cabin consisted of a single room. It was cramped, musty, kind of dirty, and very cold. The floor was made up of potato peels and pine nut shells that had been piled up over the years. The geology team tried to communicate with these people, who looked friendly enough, but they didn't quite seem to understand any of the questions. After a bit, it was determined that these people did speak a form of Russian, but it was years ago. This, combined with the family not having contact with any outsiders for years, caused for linguistic alterations. Kind of like how words take on different meanings over the years. That was the bomb at one time. It meant that something just blew up. Now it means something good. By using a combination of hand signals and different words, the geologists managed to discover who these folks were. The family was named Lykov. The father's name was Karp. He was a member of the Fundamentalists' Russian Orthodox Church that had become known as the Old Believers. When the Bolsheviks took over the country in 1917, all religion was outlawed by the communists. In an effort to make everybody equal, the Russian government rounded up anyone who refused to denounce their faith and killed them. Anyone that believes living under communism is a good thing should go read a few books. Find some folks that escaped from communism and socialism and talk to them. Well, Russia is a big country, and it took a while to search out any and all religious holdouts, but the Soviets were on a mission from, well, not from God, so maybe it was the other guy. When Karp's brother was murdered by the Bolsheviks in 1936, Karp grabbed his wife, Akolina, and 2 children, Savin and Natalia, and he headed out into the wilderness. Traveling through the forest on foot, they could only take what they could carry on their backs. 2 adults and 2 young children. They walked for miles, moving as far from their village as they could. The family was in Siberia, home to wolves and bears that were known for killing people. The summer months are short and the winter is long and cold. Once Karp decided they'd walked far enough, as in 150 miles, they began the long, hard process of cutting down trees and building a home. They didn't have many tools, only what Karp could carry. Akolina had been carrying cooking supplies, things like a pot and a sharp knife and a handful of vegetables. Being Russian farmers, I imagine the kids were loaded down as well, but really, how much equipment can 4 people carry for 150 miles through the woods? Look around your home. Now think about walking out the door with only the things you and your family can carry on your backs. Think about walking to San Antonio and then building a house by hand. For those of you not in Laredo, it's 140 miles to San Antonio. Building any kind of a structure by hand in the middle of nowhere can be hard work. Doing it using an axe and maybe a draw knife would be near impossible. So, Karp built a small, 1-room cabin. They planted some crops, potatoes mostly. They only had what they had brought. Karp didn't have a rifle, so hunting was difficult, to say the least. Where there's a will, there's a way. The family grew by 2 more kids, Dmitri and Agafia. These 2 children had never seen anyone other than the immediate family. In 1961, a bad snowstorm came in and it killed their crops. The family was forced to eat shoe leather and bark. The mother, Aquilina, wanted her children to have more food, so she simply refused to eat, slowly starving to death so her kids could have just a little more food. Having eaten their shoes, the family made shoes out of plant material. As their clothing fell apart through day-to-day use, they repaired it using anything they could find. When the kettle rusted through after years of use, there was no way to make a new cooking implement, so the family would cook their food by setting it on a rock next to the fire. One of the boys figured out how to make a snare to catch small animals to supplement their food supply. Everything was used. Nothing was wasted because it was so hard to come by. The Lykov family lived all alone in the Siberian forest until 1978, when the geologists arrived. The geologists tried to help the Lykovs by taking them back to civilization, but the family refused to leave their home. Seeing as they were staying, the geologists brought some supplies to replace what the family needed. Never having some of these things, the Lykovs refused most of these supplies. Eventually, they did accept a few knives, forks, some grain, and salt. A flashlight was handed over to them, and it was taken more as a bizarre magical thing than as a means of light. Living on such poor diets, Savin and Natalia developed kidney failure and died. Then, Dmitri caught pneumonia. The folks visiting on a regular basis offered to take him to a hospital in town, but he refused. He didn't want to leave his family, and he told the people trying to help him that a man lives for however so long God grants. The family was now down to just two, Karp and Agafia. The folks were trying to help them, offering to take the two into town where they had distant relatives, but still they refused to leave the cabin. Karp died in 1988. This left only Agafia in the cabin. Despite having no one else there, she told everyone she was going to stay there no matter what. This was her home, and she was going to stay. Well, the Soviet government did bring Agafia into town so she could see all the things she was missing. I don't know if this was to try to get her to come live in town or just so she could see things, or maybe this was some kind of a political thing where they're trying to show the world just how tough Russian people could be. This was her first encounter with things like money, or TV, or cars and trains, hotels, running water, things like that. After a month of vacationing from her work trying to survive, she went back to live in Siberia at the family cabin. In January 2016, at the age of 71, Agafia was forced to leave her home once again. She was flown into town to have her leg looked at, as she was having difficulty walking, so she finally agreed to take a helicopter ride to see a doctor. Once her leg had been treated and healed, and she was flown back out to the cabin. As she had lived there for so long with so little, it was too much of a change to try adjusting to how we civilized folks live. I can live without a TV. When my wife and I go camping, we don't have a TV in our RV. but I do take a radio. I like to listen to some music while I'm doing things like making dinner or just sitting and relaxing. I also take a lot of books to read. Agathia had one book. That was the family Bible. She went back to her drafty cabin without so much as a heater. Today, as I'm telling you about this incredible story, Agathia Lykov is living in the woods. She does now have a cat and a dog. She still does most of her own chores to put food on the table. She was the Woman of the Year last year in Russia. A funny thing, I don't know if it's funny or not, but one of the geologists decided that he was going to build a cabin near her place so he could help her out if she needed it. Well, Agathia wound up helping him out far more than he ever helped her, and he's long since died, and, well, she's still going. In 1943, in the thick of World War II, Germany wanted to force England to surrender. To do this, the Kriegsmarine set out to starve the civilians to the point of death by sinking any ships bringing food and supplies onto the island. U-boats attacked any ships on the Atlantic, while E-boats, which are like USPT boats, tried to lay mines along the mouth to the Thames. To defend the river, the British government built huge sea forts along the English Channel. Some of these had anti-aircraft guns to stop bombers, while others had anti-ship guns to sink torpedo boats. One of these forts was the H.M. Fort Ruffs, or the Ruffs Tower. The Tower Fort was constructed by the United Kingdom as one of the Munsell forts used to defend the shipping lanes in the nearby estuaries. The fort consisted of floating pontoon base with a superstructure of two hollow towers, joined by a deck upon which other structures could be added. The fort was towed to position above the Ruffs sand bar, where its base was deliberately flooded to sink it to its final resting place. There are many of these structures out at the mouth of the Thames. To be able to shoot down or sink any enemy aircraft, the forts were located approximately 7 miles from the coast of Suffolk. This placed them in international water. A ship at sea could be seen at about 3 miles from shore, so the international water was anything beyond this point. The forts would be occupied by 150 to 300 Royal Navy personnel throughout World War II. After World War II, the government maintained personnel on the forts up until 1956, just to keep the forts in place. Britain has some odd rules and regulations, to say the least. They do not have a First Amendment or freedom of speech like we enjoy here. Their radio stations and TV stations are BBC One and BBC Two and BBC Three, which had to follow government broadcast schedules. As rock and roll became popular, people wanted to listen to something besides what the government would allow. You can only listen to so much chamber music before you want to listen to some electric guitars and drums. Well, all those offshore British forts were within radio range, but they were outside of the government jurisdiction. Ruff's Tower was occupied in February 1965 by Jack Moore and his daughter Jane. They just kind of squatted there on behalf of the pirate radio station Wonderful Radio London. On September 2nd, 1967, the fort was taken over by Major Paddy Roy Bates, who was a British subject as well as a pirate radio broadcaster. He drove a competing group of pirate broadcasters out, and he took over as the radio broadcaster. Bates moved all of his equipment, intent on becoming the biggest and best radio station in all of Great Britain. His station was to be called Radio Essex. Well, after all the work was done to drive off the other stations, move equipment to the platform, and then set it up, Radio Essex never broadcast any music. Instead, Bates declared the platform independent from Britain. He established his own country, the Principality of Sealand. In 1968, a British work crew entered what Bates claimed to be his territorial waters to service a navigational buoy which was anchored near the platform. Paddy Roy Bates' son, Michael, tried to scare the workmen off by firing warning shots from the former fort. Well, Bates was still a British subject, and the government wanted to get even with this breakaway country. Bates was summoned to court, being charged on weapons charges. The United Kingdom firearms policy is based on the fact that firearms are dangerous weapons, and the state has a duty to protect the public from their misuse. I believe the actual reason for such control is to protect the government from their citizens. In Britain, you can own a shotgun if it's licensed, or a slingshot, and that's about it. Have you seen how many knife attacks they've had lately? They don't have a Second Amendment, so Bates was being charged with owning and using a rifle. Once in court, the judge was told that the offense had taken place outside the jurisdiction of the folks doing the charging. The judge threw the case out of court. 1975, Bates introduced a constitution for Sealand, along with a national flag, a national anthem, their own currency, and passports. I wonder if the money was based on gold or just fiat currency. The entire country is 168 feet by 88 feet, with a few levels below deck. In August 1978, Alexander Achenbach, who was a business partner of Bates, began calling himself the Prime Minister of Sealand. He hired several German and Dutch mercenaries, and then he launched an attack on Sealand. Achenbach was upset because Bates wouldn't go along with plans to turn Sealand into a luxury hotel and casino, along with fellow German and Dutch businessmen. The hired army stormed the platform using speedboats, jet skis, and helicopters. This had to look like some kind of a scene out of Waterworld or something. They managed to capture Bates' son, and they held him hostage. Well, not knowing any better, the son was locked up below decks, which turned out to be a big mistake. Michael went to the fort's weapons room and armed himself. He then retook Sealand, capturing Achenbach and all the mercenaries. Achenbach was a German lawyer, but he held a Sealand passport. So he was charged with treason against Sealand, and he was imprisoned unless he was able to pay 75,000 Deutschmarks, which is about $35,000. The governments of the Netherlands, Austria, and Germany began petitioning the British government demanding they do something to gain their subjects' release. Well, the United Kingdom said they couldn't do anything since Sealand was outside their jurisdiction and they had no legal authority in the case. They cited the 1968 court decision. Well, Germany sent a diplomat from its London embassy to Sealand in order to negotiate for Achenbach's release. After several weeks of negotiations, Roy Bates agreed to release his former partner and traitor to the country. Bates then pointed out that diplomat's visit constituted de facto recognition of Sealand by Germany. Following the release and the repatriation of Achenbach, he and Gernot Putz established a government in exile of Sealand, which was sometime known as Sealand Rebel Government or the Sealandic Rebel Government in Germany. In 1997, the Bates family revoked all Sealand passports. There were around 150,000 passports in circulation at the time. Someone had discovered there was a lot of money to be made and drugs to be smuggled using the official seal of Sealand to print and distribute passports. To put an end to this illegal activity, all passports from Sealand were declared null and void. This put an end to anybody moving from one country to another using a Sealand passport or as Sealand as their home country. Think about it. 150,000 people were claiming to be citizens of a country that was less than a half square mile in size. The ringleaders of this operation were based in Madrid, but they had ties to various groups in Germany, including the rebel Sealand government in exile, which had been established by Achenbach. Achenbach was selling passports at $1,000 each. June 23, 2006, the top platform of Sealand caught fire, caused by faulty electrical equipment. A Royal Air Force rescue helicopter transferred one person to Ipswich Hospital directly from the tower. The fire was eventually extinguished by a firefighting tug out of England. The damage was repaired, but Sealand was on its last legs. The PirateBay.se tried to buy Sealand so they could set up shop there after receiving so much flack from the Swedish government. Between 2007 and 2010, Sealand was offered for sale through a Spanish estate company, Inmo Naranja, at an asking price of $906 million. I'd love to own my own country, but not at that price. Roy Bates died at the age of 91 in October of 2012. He'd been suffering from Alzheimer's disease for several years. He was succeeded by his son, Michael. Joanne Bates had died in an Essex nursing home at the age of 86 in March of 2016. The claim that Sealand is an independent sovereign state is based on the interpretation of the 1968 decision of the English court, in which it was held that Ruff's Tower was international water and thus outside the jurisdiction of domestic courts. Is it its own country? According to the Germans, it is. They were the ones that sent a delegation to the fort. 1987, the UK extended its territorial waters from 3 to 12 nautical miles. Sealand now sits inside British waters. The United Kingdom is one of 165 parties to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which states that artificial islands, installations, and structures do not possess the status of being islands. They have no territorial sea of their own, and their presence does not affect the delimitation of the territorial sea, the exclusive economic zone, or the continental shelf. In other words, Sealand is not its own country. You've heard the term, what? Do you live under a rock? In the 1930s, a middle-aged prospector named Frank Kritzer staked a claim in the Giant Rock area in California. He knew that if he could fashion a house under the Giant Rock, then he would enjoy cooler temperatures in the summertime, and it would take less fuel in the wintertime to heat the home. He built a one-room subterranean home under the rock with a doorway facing west, a storage room towards the east. He set up a radio antenna on top of the rock so he could get better reception on his shortwave radio. A Giant Rock covers 5,800 square feet of ground and is 7 stories, that's about 80 feet high. Most folks considered Frank to be odd, and they tried avoiding him. Well, that's everybody except for the authorities. In 1942, thinking Kritzer was a German spy, the authorities descended on his property. Kritzer was working in a nearby cave in his workshop. The SO threw a tear gas canister into the cave, which also happened to be where Kritzer stored his dynamite. There wasn't much left of him, not enough to bury. Well, later, George Van Tassel, the UFO enthusiast, moved onto the property, but he never lived in the house under the rock. So, folks around the world find odd places to call home. I like living in a house with running water and air conditioning. The idea of having my own country is neat up until the moment something goes wrong. Then you have to find somebody to put out the fire or kick the bad guys off your turf. You can build a giant fortified mansion to live in, but what good does it do you if you invite your murderers to come live with you? If you make it hard to get in, you'll make it just as hard to get out if you have to. Surprisingly enough, the folks who are the happiest are the folks with the least. Agafia Lykov has a cabin in the woods, and that's about it. Yet, she's happy living by herself. She's relatively healthy, considering she's only visited a doctor one time in her entire life. That geologist that decided that he just had to build the cabin nearby to help her out, well, she wound up having to help him out. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. Tell your friends. Tell your enemies. Tell anybody you can to listen up. I can always use a bigger audience. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?